Good afternoon. Oh,
I'm right here, and
Yeah.
we've got our team here behind us.
thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Algonquin people, and I want to thank them on whose lands we've been on since time immemorial. We're here to talk about Bill C-61 today, and as we know, many First Nations people living on reserve still face substandard water and wastewater services. They are 90 times more likely to lack access to running water than other Canadians. With over 30 long-term water advisories still in place after decades of this crisis. As Chief Jordan Hill from Shamattawa First Nations, and I quote him, that this is a national embarrassment for each and every one of us. And it's been a long-standing issue, and every government in Canada is responsible for this. And it's time that Canada makes this right with First Nations people. I know it's not always an easy discussion. Many of these things that we talk about in our country aren't easy discussions when they come to really moving back towards a true treaty and inherent right relationship with First Nations people and First Nations governments, but they're absolutely necessary. So we're here to call on all political parties in the House, all members of Parliament in the House. We urge you to support Bill C-61. We urge you to have all party support for this as we work through the amendments, and time is crucial. And I lift you all up for your hard work on this issue, but at the same time, it's time for action, that we get down to the nitty-gritty and we start moving forward to get this done. We're hearing the crisis out there loud and clear from First Nations, and it's important that we work together, that First Nations work together, and that all members of Parliament are turning the dial on this issue and making sure that we work together quickly to make sure that this doesn't fall with an election next year or anything, right? We don't know. And so I know that it's a priority for First Nations people. It's the #1 priority for First Nations people. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, National Chief, for those remarks and for reminding all Canadians that although we've come a long way since 2015 with over 145 boil water advisories, 32 as of today remain in place. And Canada, over the last 9 years, has invested billions of dollars to try to rectify what has been an inequity, a profound inequity between municipalities that are non-Indigenous and First Nations governments, having the tools, the certainty, and the framework to be able to actually provide that clean water for their members in a consistent way. And that's what Bill C-61 does. It not only addresses some of those long-standing challenges that First Nations have faced, but it also creates a framework, really, for Canada to be a strong partner and a collaborative partner with First Nations that have the right to clean drinking water, that have an inherent right to govern themselves, and it matches that commitment with actual tools that are needed to bring life to those rights. There are aspects of this legislation that speak to First Nations' inherent right to set regulations in their own communities that meet or beat provincial standards. There are measures in this legislation that historically would ensure that all governments, as the Chief has pointed out, who are all responsible now and into the future, have an obligation to co-develop funding models for with First Nations for the delivery of water in their communities. Can you imagine that communities, and I'm sure many Canadians don't realize this, communities are at the mercy right now of the federal government in terms of the quantum of money that is spent on sufficiency of funding for water systems. That means that, for example, the amount for salaries for water operators could get arbitrarily cut by Canada. The amount for infrastructure replacement or for repairs or for training is at the discretion of Canada. And this bill changes that reality for First Nations and invites First Nations to the table with Canada to co-develop models of funding that First Nations will now have transparency and control over. So there are a number of elements of this bill that really seek to address the long-standing systemic issues that have led us to this place where Canada has, neglected the rights of First Nations to clean drinking water. And this bill has been developed with extensive input from First Nations from coast to coast to coast. I do want to thank AFN and the many chiefs across the country, as well as Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and the many other partners, including litigants of Canada, who have given their heartfelt contributions to the way that this legislation should be shaped. I was at committee today, very thoughtful questions from members of Parliament across the partisan stripes, but the chief does point out that the kinds of actions that we're seeing right now in terms of Conservatives using the House to delay government action will have impact on legislation like this. Potentially will also impact the legislation that was just announced a few minutes ago on the Self-Governing Treaty Commissioner. So I think what I would hope is that we can put aside those partisan differences, get this work done, and back into the House of Commons and to Senate so that we can conclude this piece of transformational work together. Thank you.
I want to ask the National Chief, in the Shamattawa First Nations case, which you mentioned, Canada's legal position is that Canada has no legal duty to ensure First Nations have clean water. Canada also will not recognize any Indigenous right, any specifically Indigenous right to water, safe water. Do you support that position?
No, I support the Shamattawa First Nation. I want to make that very clear. And I think that, I know that politically there's been good comments, and I'm really appalled with the Department of Justice's comments when it comes to Shamattawa. And I know that Canada has to make things right with Shamattawa First Nations and many First Nations that are, in that case. It's important, and I know that it's a tough issue. It's one that we have to come together on. We don't have Planet B, and there's only so much fresh water in this world. And many of it's right here in our own backyards, and we're so blessed and lucky to have that as Canadians, but as First Nations people, we see the discrepancies. We see how far back we are than that of other Canadians, and the provinces also shouldn't be let off the hook, as well as the entire government of Canada. Doesn't matter what party you are. I think that we all need water. We need clean water. We need access to. We need access to water in our communities and our First Nations, and it's, as the chief had said, I stand with him, it's a national disgrace. Let's get this right, and let's start working together and put politics aside and put this issue first forward and move it ahead. Thank you.
So one more follow-up on that. The bill you're discussing also does not enshrine the right to water in law, and it does not enshrine Canada's legal obligation to provide clean water in law. As you know, it just enshrines best efforts. Can you continue to support this bill if those two things do not change?
Look, absolutely, we have to make amendments. We know that. We're pushing for that, and we're working towards that. We should be going line by line through this, have it done very quickly, send it back to the House, and then send it back to the Senate. And I think that First Nations have been waiting a long time. You've heard my submission in committee this morning, and of course we've submitted our submission. You can certainly read that. And thank you. Thank you for the question.
Support at any point, though, if those changes aren't made?
Look, the Assembly of First Nations supports the bill. The Chiefs in Assembly have passed a motion to support this bill, has passed a resolution in Assembly, and I go by what the Chiefs tell me in Assembly. And we are supporting this bill, and we need to move ahead. And of course, we have to fine-tune some things together. Let's do that together, and let's get it moving. First Nations can't wait another day for clean water. We can't wait for political wrangling, and we have to make sure that we write things to get this right once and for all. Thank you.
And I might just add that I've been very public in saying that we are open to amendments that strengthen the legislation. There are a number of amendments being proposed across parties, from First Nations leaders, from different First Nations groups. I will point out that the word best efforts, as much as it sounds like that is some way for Canada to avoid its legal obligations is actually from a 1994 decision at the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Best efforts imposes a higher obligation than reasonable effort. It must take in good faith all reasonable steps to achieve the objective, carrying the process to its logical conclusion and leaving no stone unturned. It's a very high legal bar. And, but we have heard those concerns. And I will just say finally on this, it is natural for First Nations to not trust Canada. Let's consider what has happened in this country. So when I hear concerns raised from First Nations that reflect a lack of trust for their treaty partner in some cases, the Crown, the duty of the Crown, you know, these are, I think, reasonable things for First Nations people to feel and to think. And so we have to work together to make sure that the AFN, Treaty 678, many other First Nations that are speaking in their own right have the confidence that this will, in fact, improve water access and safety on First Nations.
For the Minister, you're saying that there needs to be support across all parties for this, kind of insinuating that they're holding it up. Is that not politicizing First Nations issues that you're saying you care about and you want to get passed?
Well, no, not at all. Listen, you know how the House votes. I mean, of course, if one party chooses not to support this legislation, but the other parties do, this is the nature of how the House works. But what I will say is right now, no legislation can move through the House. So as the bill completes its study and we, you know, make the amendments as appropriate and as agreed upon, and it receives, you know, and it is able to go back to the House, if we continue to see the kinds of obstruction that we're seeing from the Conservative Party, we will be in a place where we won't be able to finish the debate on this bill and send it to the Senate. Ultimately, what we're trying, we have a race against time here. And that's what First Nations are saying. They're saying they've spent the last 3 years working on this legislation, moving from draft to draft. Let me tell you, this is not the first draft that First Nations saw or worked on. In fact, this is the second draft. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people's voices participating in this process. And so that effort has been astronomical. It would be shameful to see that political posturing prevents this from becoming law.
The word shameful, that's how Lori Idlout said you should feel this morning with the characterization of the work that you've done. What's your response to that?
I say, as I said to you, that Canada has had many, many shameful chapters in its history with First Nations people. So look, I understand why people are devastated by the action of Canada, by the action of provinces, territories to not protect their safety and their access to clean water. And I think that this bill is the foundation to do better. And so I hope that we'll hear from all parliamentarians a true commitment to getting this legislation through the House and honoring the relationship with First Nations people.
Minister, you say the government's not trying to elude its legal obligations with this best efforts language, but government lawyers are in court arguing that Canada has no legal obligations to provide.
Well, with this
First
legislation, they wouldn't have that argument anymore, Brett. Thank you.
Authorize them? They're representing your government. Did you authorize them to take that position in court?
Listen, I'm not going to speak about the court case. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I in a position to be able to comment on a case in front of the court. But what I can tell you is that this legislation would not give those kinds of arguments to government lawyers.
And the comments from the Chilcotin government to put off the vote for the final settlement agreement?
Certainly. The final settlement agreement, you mean for child welfare for next week? Looks, we've heard from chiefs coast to coast to coast who are ready to move forward. Of course, there's some that, look, it's been that's also been a national disgrace. Child welfare in this country has been horrific on our women and our children. And look, when I have, you know, it shouldn't be that, you know, Canadian children get one set of rules and one set of funding, and that First Nations children, it bumps up, and that we have to put our children into care in order to get them services and programs. That's so unacceptable, and it's a hurtful system, and it's been embedded in our people for the past 150 years, from the time of residential schools, day schools, the 60s scoop. Now all of us as leaders in this entire country, this is what we have before us, is a really broken child welfare system. And I know that people maybe want more time. It is a big agreement. It's many, many pages, and it's increasing as we make, amendments here and there. We've worked on amendments again yesterday to make sure, because we're hearing what the chiefs are saying, so that they feel comfortable in moving forward with that. But absolutely moving massive amounts of money away from the provinces to First Nations. Look at how political it gets. Look at how suppressive and oppressive it gets on the divide and conquer strategy to not move forward. And I think that First Nations kids deserve to be in First Nations communities, learning our language, having our cultures, having our parents, our grandparents, our aunts, uncles, and cousins around. I couldn't be standing here in front of you as strong as I am without that backbone of my family. And I certainly, couple of the both chiefs behind me have been through that horrific system, and they know the shortcomings of that. And so moving it back towards First Nations control, First Nations-led approach is really, it's difficult for this country to grasp at some point. I mean, there's a push here in Ottawa to wipe that money off the table. And that's unacceptable. And I think that those investments, we have to move towards a prevention approach with preventing these kind of things from happening, with our kids being taken off. Look, they'll take my children easily, or anyone of, a First Nations child, they take them off away from me. And if I'm struggling with poverty because of systemic racism in this country, and then they take my children off the community, then they give another family all the resources. They give them food, they make sure they have a home, they do all these things. Why didn't you do that for the First Nations families in the first place? And so I know that there's lots of issues to work through on it, and I know that, of course, there's always wanting to be maybe a little bit of a pause, because we kind of wonder, is this going to be okay? But I look forward to the discussion next week with chiefs in assembly. We're all coming together next week. There's a high number that have already registered, because everybody's so passionate about it. So you will hear passionate voices next week, because it's about something so precious that it's our children. If every children matters to belong in one of our First Nations communities. They deserve their language, culture, and a connection to our land and our people, including safe drinking water, which is what we're here to talk about today. Thank you.
Yeah. The amendments. You just said that there's amendments that were put forward in the agreement last night. Does that give First Nations enough time before next week to review and go through all of these amendments before they're voting on it?
Look, we're going to be talking about all those amendments with Chief in Assembly. As you know, we always have limited time as it is. We have 3 days in July, 3 days in December. We're putting 3 special days aside just to focus on this issue, go through it line by line, of course, with legal counsel in the room, with leadership, and we've heard chiefs loud and clear, regional representation. We had to strengthen that. We've done that, and we've done some other things that chiefs have told us to do over the course of the past few months as we've been going across the country hearing their concerns about amendments. And I think that that's healthy, good debate, and it's health. They're putting forward amendments that they want to make sure that it strengthens it, and so we've been working through that with the other parties at the table. It's not always easy, as you know, in negotiations, but 47.8 billion, that's a historic number, and I know we look forward to that discussion with all of First Nations people next week as we talk about this hard issue, very hard and sensitive issue, and we've never had this conversation in this country at such the length that we've had it. And as National Chief, as a woman, as a mom, that was one of my first things. Is our children well? They're not. We have a real sad, even though I'm happy for the work, it's a sad situation. And every time you see a First Nations person on the streets of any Canadian city, most likely they come from that system, and that's wrong. And we can't keep doing that to people in our country, and we have to work together. So, thank you.